My brother-in-law dragged me from my home when I was 6 months pregnant. "This baby will be mine," he screamed as he pulled me away. For 89 days, I was chained in a basement, praying I could escape before my child was born into the hands of that monster. Good morning, my dear friends. It's so wonderful to be here chatting with you all. My name is Geneva Adams, but everyone knows me as Grandma Gina. I'm 73 years old, a gray-haired grandma with many stories to tell. I was born in Augusta, Maine, but today I live here in Flagstaff, Arizona, pretty close to the Grand Canyon. Who would have thought destiny would bring me so far from my birthplace, right? These days, I spend my time tending to my little embroidery studio. I have a small table on my front porch where the light is good for my tired eyes. I make tablecloths, napkins, bed sheets, all hand-embroidered, just like my grandmother taught me. I started this work after my grandchildren were already grown up. Before that, my life was dedicated to caring for my family. But one day, my neighbor Mrs. Justine saw me embroidering and ordered a tablecloth. More orders followed, and now I even have a little page on the internet that my granddaughter Clarice made for me. I'm sitting here in my living room, you see. It's a simple space, but filled with love. I have an old sofa covered with crochet work I made myself, a small coffee table with a pot of violets. I adore violets, they bring me peace. And there on the wall is a picture frame with a photo of the whole family gathered at my youngest granddaughter, Bernice's 15th birthday. Beside me is Toby, my old cat who sleeps more than he watches. Poor thing, he's already 12 years old. Before I continue, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoyed meeting me, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any little stories I share here. This helps tremendously in bringing my words to more people who need to hear them. And for my friends my age who are watching, please comment below. What time of day are you watching me? And also, tell me where you're listening from, dears. Today, I'm going to tell a story that I've kept inside me for many years. It's not easy to talk about, but I think the time has come. You know, some wounds only heal when we expose them to the sun, and this wound has been hidden for too long. It's about a very difficult period in my life, when I was expecting my first child and had to face evil up close, an evil that came from within the family itself. At the time, I was young, full of dreams, newly married to Arnold, my late husband. We lived in a simple house, but it was ours, you know, built with a lot of effort. I worked at the town pharmacy as a clerk, and Arnold was a truck driver, making long trips. The news of the pregnancy was the greatest joy of our lives. I remember as if it were yesterday the look on his face when I told him, his teary eyes, that big smile. We already started dreaming about the baby's room, the toys, the future. But I never imagined that moment of happiness would turn into the worst nightmare anyone could live through. How could we have known that danger was so close? That the one we called family would be capable of? Oh my God, it's still difficult to talk about. But I'll tell you everything, from the beginning. Because this story needs to serve as a warning for other women. It all began back in my childhood, when I was still an innocent little girl running through the yards of Augusta, Maine, never imagining the challenges life had in store for me. I was born in 1952, in a small wooden house near the Kennebec River in Augusta. My father, Jack Adams, worked as a fisherman and knew the river like the back of his hand. He was a strong man, of few words, but with an immense heart. My mother, Dorothy, was a seamstress and laundress, always with busy hands, either sewing for the townspeople or washing clothes by the river. We had a simple life, but we never lacked food on the table. We were 4 siblings, me, the oldest, then came Leonard, 2 years younger, Martha, who arrived 3 years after Leonard, and finally the youngest, Albert, who was born when I was already 9 years old. Our house was small, made of wood, with a raised floor because of the spring floods. It had only 2 bedrooms, one for my parents and one for us children. In the front, a porch where Mom sewed and Dad repaired his fishing nets. In the back, a large yard with apple, pear, and cherry trees. My childhood was regulated by the rhythm of the river. During low water, we played on the beach that formed. During high water, we stayed more at home or at the neighbors' stilted houses. The school was a half-hour walk away, and I would go with Leonard, hand in hand, along the dirt path. We studied in the morning and helped at home in the afternoon. I learned to sew with Mom and took care of my younger siblings. Life was like that, you know? Simple, but good. On Sunday mornings, we went to St. Joseph's Church, the little white church in the square. Afterward, there was always a special lunch. A bigger fish that Dad caught on Saturday, prepared with lemon and herbs, accompanied by cornbread that Mom bought at the market. And during the 4th of July celebrations, oh, how beautiful it was. The whole town decorated, the fireworks, the parade in the square. I loved to dance, you know. I wore a gingham dress that Mom sewed, put colored ribbons in my hair, and went skipping to the celebration. But not everything was rosy. When I was about 8 years old, a big flood came, the kind where the river rose so much it invaded homes. We lost almost everything. I remember my father carrying us on his back, crossing water that already reached his waist. We stayed for a while at my aunt's house, Aunt Natalie, who lived in a higher part of town. It was difficult, but we recovered, as always happens with riverside folk. At school, I was a good student, especially in English. Teacher Eulalia always said I had a way with words. "This girl will go far," she would say, and I really dreamed of being a teacher one day. I wanted to teach children to read and write. I thought it was so beautiful. My childhood friends. There was Claire, my best friend, daughter of the town midwife, James, son of the store owner, and Irene, who lived next door to us. We played in the water, hide and seek among the boats, made paper boats. We didn't have store-bought toys, but we had fun with what nature offered. When I turned 12, I began to notice a change at home. Dad was more quiet, worried. The fishing money wasn't yielding as much as before. Large fishing boats from companies in the South were arriving, and small fishermen like him suffered because of this. That's when he decided we needed to try life elsewhere. One night in July 1964, after dinner, he gathered the whole family and said, "We're going to Boston. I have a cousin there who got me work at the shipyard. It will be better for all of us." Mom cried softly but agreed. She always trusted his decisions. For me, it was a shock. Leaving Augusta, my friends, the school, the river I loved so much. But I had no choice. At 12 years old, you obey your parents, period. We packed our few things in boxes and trunks, said goodbye to neighbors and relatives, and boarded a Greyhound bus, those buses that transport passengers across New England. The trip to Boston took a whole day. I remember standing at the front of the bus, watching the brown waters of the river, the giant trees on the banks, trying to record everything in my memory because something told me I wouldn't return anytime soon. And it was there, on that journey downstream, that I left my childhood behind. I didn't know it yet, but that innocent girl, daughter of the fisherman from Augusta, was heading toward a future that would completely change the course of her life. Our life in Boston began cramped. We went to live in a neighborhood called Dorchester, in a wooden house smaller than the one in Augusta, borrowed from that cousin of my father's, Mr. Joseph. It was a place full of raised houses on the banks of a creek that, on days of heavy rain, overflowed and flooded everything. Dad started working at the shipyard as promised, but the salary barely covered expenses. Mom continued sewing, now with a new clientele that she gradually built up. I started studying at a larger school, Dorchester High School. It was difficult to adapt. The city children thought I was a hick, imitated my way of speaking, laughed at my simple clothes. I cried in hiding many nights, missing Augusta, my friends, the wide river I could see from my window. But I got used to it, as we always get used to what is necessary. The years went by. I finished high school and started working at a notion store in downtown Boston. I was already 17 and helped with household expenses. My siblings were also growing up. Leonard was already working with Dad at the shipyard. Martha was studying and helping Mom with sewing, and Albert was still in school. It was at that store that I met Arnold. He came in looking for thread and buttons for his mother, who was also a seamstress. Tall, broad-shouldered, neatly trimmed black hair, and a shy smile. I served him with all courtesy, but I noticed that he was looking at me longer than necessary. The following week, he returned, and then the next, always with some excuse to buy something, until he gathered the courage and invited me for ice cream after my shift. Arnold was 22, worked as a truck driver's assistant, and dreamed of having his own truck one day. He wasn't from Boston. He had come from rural Pennsylvania with his family when he was a teenager. He told me his father had passed away early, and his mother, Mrs. Zelda, raised him and his younger brother alone. Ah, his brother. Owen. It still gives me chills to remember that name. At the time, he was 19 and worked as a mechanic's assistant. I met him a few weeks after I started dating Arnold. He came along when Arnold took me to meet Mrs. Zelda. I remember that. While his mother was all smiles and hugs, Owen stayed in a corner, quiet, watching me with a look that made me uncomfortable. I didn't give it much importance at the time, thought it was just shyness or perhaps brotherly jealousy. The courtship with Arnold was quick and intense. In 6 months, we were already talking about marriage. He had managed to save up some money and bought a small plot of land in a remote neighborhood called Roslindale. He started building a little house there on weekends. My father, suspicious like any father of a single girl, went to see the land, helped with the construction a few times, and ended up giving his blessing. We got married in January 1972. A simple ceremony at St. Raymond's Church, followed by a little party in my family's backyard. We went to live in the Roslindale house, which was still half finished, but at least had the bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom ready. The rest we would finish little by little. The first months were pure happiness. Arnold got a job as a driver in a transport company and no longer needed to travel as an assistant. Now he drove the truck himself. I continued at the notion store, and on weekends I took care of our little house, planted some flowers and vegetables in the yard, received visits from family. It was during this period that I began to notice something strange in Owen's behavior. He would show up without warning, almost always when he knew Arnold was traveling for work. He said he came to see if I needed anything, if everything was okay. At first, I even thought it was kind of him. After all, he was my brother-in-law, my husband's family. But soon I realized that the visits had another purpose. He brought gifts, a sweet he said he had made thinking of me, a little plant for the garden, a decoration for the house. He would look at me in a way that made me nervous. He started to make comments like, "Arnold doesn't deserve you," or, "If you were my wife, I wouldn't leave you alone so much." I would change the subject, try to keep everything in the friendship of in-laws. I told Arnold, who spoke with his brother, but Owen swore it was just family concern, that I had misunderstood. Things got worse when, in October 1972, I discovered I was pregnant. The happiness was immense. Arnold cried when I told him, hugged me tight, already started making plans for the future of our son or daughter. The whole family celebrated, except Owen. When he heard the news, I saw something change in his look, a mixture of anger and obsession. I can't explain it exactly. His visits became more frequent and more disturbing. One day, he touched my belly without asking permission, saying, "This baby, it should be mine." I froze. I asked him to leave and called Arnold, who was on a trip. My husband returned earlier than planned, furious, and had an ugly fight with his brother. The two almost came to blows. After that, Owen stayed away for a while. I thought the problem was over, but it was just beginning. In March 1973, when I was almost 6 months pregnant, Arnold needed to make a longer trip to Philadelphia. It would be 10 days away. He didn't want to go because of my already advanced pregnancy, but the boss insisted, and the extra salary would be welcome with the baby coming. On the second night after Arnold traveled, I was at home, alone, preparing tea before bed. I heard a noise in the yard. I thought it was some animal, maybe a cat. But soon after, the kitchen door was violently broken down. It was Owen, with a look I had never seen before. He seemed possessed. "I've come to get what's mine," he said, advancing in my direction. I tried to run, scream, defend myself, but what could a 6-month pregnant woman do against a determined man like him? He grabbed me by the hair, covered my mouth with a cloth that had a strong, strange smell. I started to get dizzy, my vision blurring. The last thing I remember was him dragging me out of the house saying, "Now you're going to be mine, and this child too." I woke up in a dark, damp place. It took me a while to understand where I was. It was a kind of cabin or shack in the middle of what seemed to be a wooded area. My wrists were tied to an old bed. I felt despair consume me when I understood what had happened. I had been kidnapped by my own brother-in-law. The days that followed were a nightmare. Owen had prepared that place in advance. There was food, water, even some women's clothes. He came 2-3 times a day. Brought meals, untied me to go to the improvised bathroom, and then tied me up again. He talked nonstop about how happy they would be. He, me, and our son, as he called the baby in my belly. "Arnold will never find us," he said. "We're hours away from Boston, in an area that only I know. When the baby is born, we'll go to another state, start a new life. No one will know the child isn't mine. We'll be a happy family." I begged, cried, tried to make him understand the madness he was committing. "Please, Owen, think of the baby. I need doctor's care. I can't have a child here in these conditions." But he didn't listen. In his head, he had everything planned. He said he knew a midwife in a nearby village, that she would come when the time arrived. Time passed with excruciating slowness. I marked the days by making little marks on the wooden wall with a stone I found. I tried to stay calm and sane for the baby, who was moving more and more in my belly. I talked to him softly when I was alone, promising that I would find a way to escape, that I wouldn't let that crazy man separate us from Arnold. Sometimes, Owen had fits of rage, especially when I refused to respond to his kindnesses or when I cried calling for Arnold. At those times, he would scream, throw things on the floor, threaten me. He never hit me in the belly, I think because of the baby he considered his. But he would slap my face, pull my hair. I endured silently, thinking only of protecting my child. During one of these crises, he revealed that he had sent a letter to his mother and to Arnold, pretending to be me, saying that I couldn't stand the life I led anymore and had run away with another man to rural Pennsylvania. "They'll never look for you," he laughed. "They think you abandoned everything of your own free will." That destroyed me. Imagining Arnold thinking I had betrayed him, abandoned him while pregnant with our child. As the weeks passed, my belly grew, and so did my despair. I was already in the 8th month, increasingly difficult to move, and the fear of giving birth in those conditions terrified me. Owen started to bring baby clothes, a wooden cradle that he said he had made with his own hands. In his head, we were about to form a family. It was on a late afternoon, when the rain was falling heavily outside, that I felt the first contractions. They weren't yet the ones for birth, but they scared me. I realized my time was running out. If I didn't escape soon, my child would be born there, in the hands of that disturbed man, and I would probably never see my family, my husband, my previous life again. That night, I did something I hadn't had the courage to do until then. I pretended. I pretended that I was beginning to accept the situation, that maybe we could indeed have some kind of life together. I saw his eyes shine with this possibility. "I knew you would end up understanding," he said, caressing my face. I asked him not to tie me up that night, as proof of trust. Reluctant at first, he eventually agreed. I waited for him to fall deeply asleep. The rain had stopped, and a weak moonlight entered through the cracks in the cabin. With all care, I got up. Each movement was painful with that belly. I took a knife that he used to cut fruit and hid it among my clothes. At the door, I hesitated for a second. I didn't know what awaited me out there, in the middle of the forest, in the dark. But anything would be better than that captivity. I left slowly, stepping carefully to make no noise. When I was a few meters from the cabin, I started to run as fast as my condition allowed. I didn't know where I was going, just followed what seemed to be a trail in the woods. The moon was my only light. The fear that Owen would wake up and come after me gave me strength I didn't know I had. I ran, walked, crawled for hours. My feet were bleeding, my belly weighed me down, the contractions returned stronger. When the sun began to rise, I heard the sound of running water. I followed the direction and found a river, not as big as the Kennebec, but flowing. In the distance, I saw a small vessel, a boat with an outboard motor, and an elderly man preparing to depart. I shouted, waved desperately. The man, an old-timer with white hair named Mr. Raymond, was startled to see a pregnant woman, hurt, coming out of the woods at that hour. I told a summarized version of the story, begging for help. He didn't hesitate to welcome me onto the boat. "I'm going to take you to Boston, my child. Hold on," he said, starting the motor. As the boat advanced along the river, I looked back one last time at the forest that had been my prison for almost 3 months. I felt a stronger contraction and knew at that moment that my child would be born in freedom. But the nightmare wasn't completely over yet. The journey back to Boston in Mr. Raymond's little boat was agonizing. The contractions increased in frequency and intensity. The old man rowed as fast as he could, while I bit a piece of cloth to keep from screaming in pain. The fear of giving birth there, in the middle of the river, without any assistance, terrified me. But what tormented me most was the thought, what if Owen comes after me? What if he's already discovered I escaped? We arrived at a small port on the outskirts of Boston late in the afternoon. Mr. Raymond, who knew people in the region, got a pickup truck ride to take me to the nearest hospital. I remember the frightened look of the nurse who received me. I was dirty, hurt, dehydrated, with a huge 8-month belly and increasingly strong contractions. "Who did this to you, my child?" she asked while helping me lie on a stretcher. I told a summarized version of the story between moans of pain. She called the police while the doctors took care of me. The contractions, fortunately, began to calm down. It was a false alarm, provoked by the stress and physical effort of the escape. I stayed in the hospital for 3 days. My family was located and came running to the hospital. Mom, Dad, my siblings. Everyone cried with relief to see me. They told me that when they received that false letter, they didn't believe it for a minute. They knew my love for Arnold, knew of my happiness with the pregnancy. They had searched everywhere, filed a police report, but without concrete clues, the searches had cooled. The hardest part was hearing about Arnold. When he returned from his trip and found the empty house, the lying letter, he went crazy. He searched everywhere, questioned all acquaintances. He confronted Owen, who swore he knew nothing. In the confusion of the searches, he ended up losing his job for missing many days. When he heard I had been found, he came straight to the hospital. I will never forget the image of him entering the hospital room, haggard, thinner, deep dark circles under his eyes, but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. When he saw me, he fell to his knees beside the bed, crying like a child. "Forgive me for not protecting you," he said between sobs. I cried too, trying to explain it wasn't his fault. The police went after Owen as soon as I filed the formal complaint, but he had disappeared. The cabin where he kept me prisoner was found days later with clear evidence of the kidnapping, ropes, my clothes, even a diary where he wrote about his sick plans for us. A search began throughout the state, but he seemed to have vanished into thin air. We were discharged from the hospital and went to my parents' house, since our house in Roslindale was no longer safe, and also because it brought too many painful memories. Arnold got a temporary job as a goods deliveryman, while we tried to reorganize our lives. It was a period of constant anguish. I couldn't sleep well. I had horrible nightmares, woke up screaming, in a cold sweat. Any noise startled me. I couldn't be alone even for a minute. The fear that Owen would appear to finish what he started consumed me day and night. With each passing day, my belly grew more, constantly reminding me of the trauma, but also of the life that was about to arrive. It was a confusing feeling, immense love for the baby, but terror because of the circumstances. The doctors prescribed mild sedatives, safe for pregnancy, but nothing really relieved that sensation of imminent danger. Arnold suffered as much as I did, in different ways. He carried an immense guilt for not having believed me when I talked about the first strange visits from his brother. He blamed himself for having traveled during those days, for not having protected me better. At night, I heard him crying hidden in the bathroom so as not to worry me more. Our relationship, once so light and happy, was now loaded with trauma, fears, and unspoken guilt. At the end of June 1973, nearly 9 months pregnant, I had a strong nervous breakdown after thinking I had seen Owen on the street, watching my parents' house. It was just a similar-looking man, but the shock was so great that I had to be rushed to the hospital. The doctors decided to advance the delivery by cesarean section, concerned with my emotional state and the baby's safety. Our son was born on June 28th, a strong and healthy boy despite everything. We gave him the name Gabriel, strength of God, because only God could give us strength at that moment. Holding that baby in my arms for the first time was like a ray of light after months in darkness. For a few moments, I forgot the fear, the pain, the trauma. It was just me and my son, a connection that no one, not even Owen, could break. But the joy of motherhood came mixed with new fears. What if Owen returned to try to take Gabriel? This idea tormented me. I didn't let anyone outside the immediate family hold the baby. I checked the windows and doors 10, 20 times before sleeping. I woke up at his every cry, not just like any first-time mother, but with the terror of finding the crib empty. As the weeks passed, the emotional problems only increased. I began to have panic attacks. My heart would race, I couldn't breathe, I would shake all over. I had vivid flashbacks of captivity, sometimes during common activities, like bathing Gabriel or preparing a meal. Suddenly, it was as if I were back in that cabin, tied up, at the mercy of that man. I couldn't breastfeed properly anymore. The milk decreased with all the stress. I rapidly lost weight. I couldn't eat, sleep. Deep, dark circles marked my once youthful face. My mother and my sisters took turns taking care of me and Gabriel because I had days when I could barely get out of bed. Arnold tried everything to help me, but he himself was destroyed. The betrayal of his own brother, the powerlessness in the face of my suffering, the constant concern with our safety. All this corroded him from within. He arranged a steady job at a transport company, but the life we dreamed of together seemed increasingly distant. The police continued looking for Owen, but without success. Information came that he might have fled to another state, perhaps to Pennsylvania or New York. The uncertainty of not knowing where he was, if he would ever return, was like a permanent shadow over us. When Gabriel was 3 months old, I received a visit from a social worker referred by the hospital. She perceived my critical state and suggested that I seek psychological help. At the time, this wasn't as common as it is today. There was even a certain prejudice. But I was so desperate that I accepted. I started attending a support group for women victims of violence, coordinated by a psychologist, Dr. Bernice. There, for the first time, I could speak openly about everything I went through, without judgments, without looks of pity. Hearing other women with stories as painful as mine made me feel less alone. It wasn't just me, and some of them had managed to move forward, rebuild their lives. It was in therapy that I began to understand the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, although at the time, this term wasn't used much. My symptoms, the flashbacks, the constant fear, the hypervigilance, the panic attacks, had a name, had an explanation. It wasn't my weakness, as I thought. It was a natural response of the body and mind to severe trauma. Gradually, very gradually, I learned techniques to deal with panic attacks, to calm the mind when bad thoughts invaded. Arnold also began to participate in some sessions, which helped to strengthen our fragile relationship. We started to talk more openly about our fears, our guilt, our hopes. Gabriel grew strong and healthy, oblivious to all the drama surrounding his birth. His smile, his first teeth, the way he held my finger tightly. These were small daily miracles that gave me reason to continue. to fight against internal demons. But our life in Boston was too marked by trauma. Every corner could hide Owen's figure. Every unknown face on the street could be him. The house we built with so much love in Roslindale remained abandoned. None of us could go back there. And with time, it became clear that we needed a complete fresh start in another place, away from all these memories. It was then that, in one of the therapy sessions, Dr. Bernice suggested something that would completely change the course of our lives. Why don't you consider moving to another state? A place where nobody knows you, where you can really start over? The idea, which seemed radical at first, began to make more and more sense. Arnold had a distant uncle in Arizona who always invited him to visit. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe it was time to leave New England, the waters of the Atlantic, the city that now only reminded us of pain and fear. But the decision wasn't easy. It meant leaving behind our families, our few friends, everything we knew. It meant a leap in the dark, with a small baby and heart still wounded. And even so, deep down, I knew it was our only chance for true healing. The move to Arizona wasn't an easy decision. We spent weeks discussing, weighing pros and cons. My parents were devastated by the possibility of seeing us so rarely. At that time, traveling from Massachusetts to the Southwest was expensive and time-consuming. But they also understood our need to start over in a place where the shadows of the past wouldn't reach us. Arnold contacted his uncle, Mr. Gary, who lived in Flagstaff, near the Grand Canyon. He not only invited us to stay at his house while we established ourselves, but also promised to help Arnold find work. It was February 1974. Gabriel was almost 8 months old, and we made the final decision. We would go to the Southwest. We sold the little we had, including the unfinished house in Roslindale, for a value well below what it was worth, but we needed the money for the move. My family organized a small farewell party, where everyone cried a lot. Mom gave me a rosary that had belonged to my grandmother, saying, "To protect you in the distant land, my daughter." The journey was long and tiring. First, a bus from Boston to New York. Then, a train to Chicago, where we stayed 2 days resting in a cheap boarding house. Finally, another bus to Flagstaff. It was almost 10 days of travel with a small baby. Gabriel, surprisingly, behaved well most of the time, as if he understood the importance of that journey. We arrived in Flagstaff in March 1974, exhausted, but with a small flame of hope. Arizona was a completely different world from what we knew. The warmer climate, the desert landscape so distinct from the New England forests, people's accents, the food, everything was new and strange. In the first days, I felt like a foreigner in my own country. Mr. Gary and his wife, Mrs. Elaine, received us with all affection. They had a simple but comfortable house near the center of the city. He worked as a ranger at the Grand Canyon National Park, and she taught piano at home. They had no children, so they were charmed with Gabriel, treating him like the grandchild they never had. Arnold soon got a job as a driver in a transport company that did the route between Flagstaff and Phoenix. The salary wasn't much, but it was enough for us to start saving for our own little corner. I stayed at home in the first months, taking care of Gabriel and trying to adapt to the new reality. The emotional problems continued, although less intense. I still had frequent nightmares, still got scared with sudden noises, still checked the windows and doors several times. But being so far from Boston, knowing that Owen would probably never find us there, brought immense relief. It was Mrs. Elaine who perceived my internal struggle and helped me find the path to true recovery. She herself had been through a great loss, a child who was stillborn, and knew well the marks that trauma leaves on the soul. One afternoon, while Gabriel slept, she sat with me on the porch and simply invited me to talk. And I talked. I told everything, from the beginning, without hiding anything. I talked about the kidnapping, the captivity, the constant fear, the nightmares, the panic attacks. I talked about the guilt I felt for having made my family go through all that, for having exposed my son to danger even before he was born. I talked about the anger I felt toward Owen, an anger that consumed me from within. Mrs. Elaine listened to me attentively, without interrupting, without judging. When I finished, she took my hands between hers and said, "My child, you need to forgive." I was shocked. Forgive? Forgive that man who destroyed my life, who kidnapped me, who almost made me lose my child? Impossible. "I'm not talking about forgiving him," she explained in a soft voice. "I'm talking about forgiving yourself. You are not to blame for anything that happened. You were a victim. And while you carry this guilt and this anger, he will continue to have power over you, even being so far away." Those words hit me like lightning. I had never thought that way. I was so busy fearing and hating Owen that I didn't realize how this kept me tied to the trauma, like an invisible chain that linked me to the past. Mrs. Elaine introduced me to a prayer group that met weekly at the local church. It wasn't a formal therapy group like the one I attended in Boston, but it ended up having a powerful therapeutic effect. There, I found women of unshakable faith who had been through their own trials, serious illnesses, loss of children, violent husbands, and still maintained hope and goodness in their hearts. One of these women, Mrs. Zelda, became especially important in my journey. With her 70 years and a wisdom that only a hard life can give, she taught me breathing and meditation techniques that help to control anxiety attacks. When fear comes, breathe deeply and repeat, "I am safe now, I am safe now," she would say. And it worked. Little by little, I began to reconquer small freedoms. I managed to stay alone at home for short periods. I started taking Gabriel to the little park near home. I went back to sleeping without needing medication to calm down. Small victories, but ones that represented giant steps in my recovery. In August 1974, we received news that marked a true turning point in our lives. The Massachusetts police had finally located and arrested Owen. He was hiding in an isolated community in rural Pennsylvania, working as a mechanic under a false name. Someone recognized his photo on a wanted poster and made the report. The news brought a mix of emotions. Relief, of course, to know that he was in prison and could no longer harm us. But it also brought all the trauma to the surface again. I had terrible nightmares in the following nights. The police wanted me to return to Boston to testify at the trial, but the simple idea of being in the same room as him, of looking at that face again, caused me panic attacks. It was the detective responsible for the case, Detective Harrison, who found a solution. He came personally to Flagstaff to take my testimony. A middle-aged man, serious but gentle, who demonstrated a rare sensitivity for a police officer of that time. "Ma'am, you've been through enough suffering," he said. "We don't need to force you to relive all this in person." Giving that testimony was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Reliving every detail, every moment of those 3 months of captivity was like opening wounds that were just beginning to heal. But at the same time, it was liberating. It was as if, by putting all that into words, by transforming my experience into an official document that would help do justice, I was also freeing myself from the weight of carrying that story alone. Detective Harrison assured me that, with the evidence found in the cabin and my detailed testimony, there was more than enough material to condemn Owen to many years in prison. "Ma'am, you can continue your life in peace now," he said before leaving. "He won't hurt you again." Those words were like a balm for my wounded soul. For the first time in a long time, I began to truly believe that we could have a future, that the nightmare had been left behind. With the news of Owen's arrest, Arnold also began to free himself from his own demons. The guilt he carried for not having protected me, the shame of having a brother capable of such atrocity, the constant fear, all this began to dissipate. He returned to smiling more, to making plans, to playing with Gabriel without that shadow of worry in his gaze. In October 1974, with our modest savings and a small loan that Mr. Gary helped us get, we bought our first little house in Flagstaff. It was small, only 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, and bathroom, but it was ours. A place to rebuild our life, to raise our son, to heal our wounds. On the day we moved, I did something symbolic. I brought a little soil from the garden of Mr. Gary's house and planted a jasmine seedling in our yard. "This plant," I said to Arnold while Gabriel crawled nearby, "will grow along with our new life. Each flower will be a reminder that we survived and are here together." It was there, in that simple little house in Flagstaff, with my son growing strong and my husband recovering the joy of living, that I finally began to feel safe again. Not completely healed, some scars never completely disappear, but ready to look forward, to build new memories that would be stronger than the painful ones. And it was also there that I began to perceive a strength within me that I didn't know existed, a resilience that allowed me to survive the unimaginable and still find reasons to smile, to love, to be thankful for life. As Mrs. Zelda used to say, "You are not just a survivor, my child. You are a warrior." This realization was perhaps the biggest turning point of all. I was not just a victim of my story, I was the protagonist, and it was up to me to decide how the rest of the story would be written. Our life in Flagstaff began to gain its own rhythm after we moved into our little house. Gabriel, already over a year old, was taking his first steps, filling the house with that joy that only a child can bring. Arnold continued working as a driver, now respected in the company for his commitment and dedication. And I, finally feeling more security, decided it was time for me to also contribute in some way. I started doing small sewing work at home, something I learned from my mother back in Augusta. At first, they were just repairs: pants hems, replaced zippers, adjusted clothes. I put a small sign in Mr. Albert's grocery store on the corner of our street, offering my services. Soon, the first clients began to appear. One of these clients, Mrs. Ivy, wife of the bank manager, liked my work so much that she ordered an embroidered tablecloth for their wedding anniversary. I was nervous. One thing was doing repairs, quite another was creating something new. But I remembered the embroidery techniques that my grandmother taught me when I was a girl, and I accepted the challenge. I spent nights working on that tablecloth while Gabriel slept. I embroidered typical southwestern flowers in delicate stitches that formed a harmonious design on the edges of the fabric. When I delivered it, Mrs. Ivy was amazed. "What exquisite work! You have a gift, Geneva." That sincere compliment was like a balm for my wounded self-esteem. Soon, the news of my embroidery spread among the ladies of Flagstaff society. I began to receive orders for tablecloths, napkins, sheets, and even baptism dresses. Arnold, seeing my enthusiasm, used part of our savings to buy a Singer sewing machine, one of those pedal ones. I set up a little corner in the living room, near the window that looked out to the yard, where I could work and still watch Gabriel playing. In November 1975, we received the news that Owen had been sentenced to 12 years in prison. Detective Harrison personally called to inform us. It was a moment of profound relief, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from our shoulders. That night, Arnold and I sat on the porch after putting Gabriel to bed, and for the first time in a long time, we talked about the future without fear. The following year, in 1976, I discovered I was pregnant again. Unlike the first pregnancy, marked by terror in the last months, this one was tranquil, full of expectation and joy. In December of that year, our daughter, Mariana, was born. Gabriel, almost 3.5 years old, was enchanted with his little sister, always wanting to help take care of her. It was also during this period that I began to take the first steps to help other women who were going through difficult situations. It wasn't anything formal, just conversations in the kitchen of our home, a friendly shoulder, advice based on my own experience. It started with a neighbor who suffered domestic violence and didn't know how to get out of that situation. Then came others, usually brought by Mrs. Zelda or other ladies from the prayer group. Our life was simple, but happy. On Sundays, we went to Mass at the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church, then had lunch as a family, sometimes inviting Mr. Gary and Mrs. Elaine. On winter afternoons, which in Flagstaff are quite rigorous, we all stayed together around the fireplace, drinking hot chocolate, a custom we adopted with pleasure. I would tell stories of New England to the children, keeping alive the good memories of my native land. In 1980, our family grew again with the arrival of Robert, our youngest. The house was already getting small for the five of us, and we started thinking about moving. That's when an opportunity arose for Arnold in Flagstaff itself. A large transport company was opening a branch there and offered him the position of fleet manager with a much better salary. In January 1981, we made another move. We sold our little house and bought a larger one in Flagstaff with a spacious yard for the children to play and an extra room that I transformed into my sewing and embroidery studio. My work with embroidery continued to grow. A lady from the city, Mrs. Carmen, had a small home goods store and began selling my pieces there. It was a welcome extra income, which helped with household expenses and the children's education. Gabriel was already almost 8 years old and showed himself to be an intelligent and protective boy, always taking care of his sister and younger brother. We maintained contact with my family in Massachusetts through letters and occasional telephone calls. Long-distance calls were expensive at that time. In 1983, we managed to save enough money for a visit. It was the first time I returned to Boston since we left in 1974. A whirlwind of emotions invaded me when the plane landed. My parents were already elderly, my siblings married with their own families. It was an emotional reunion. They finally met Mariana and Robert and saw how Gabriel had grown. I spent 2 weeks there, showing my children the place where I was born, the great Kennebec River, the different fruits, the customs of the region. It was a form of reconnection with my roots, but also of perceiving how much I had advanced in my journey of healing. I returned to Flagstaff with a lighter heart, certain that I had made the right choices. Our life followed its tranquil course. Arnold prospered at work, the children grew healthy and studied well. I continued with my embroidery, now with a loyal clientele and some orders that came even from neighboring cities. In 1986, we had a scare. A letter arrived with the seal of the Massachusetts State Prison. It was from Owen. After serving part of his sentence, he had the right to write. In the letter, he asked for forgiveness, said he had repented, that he had found religion in prison and changed. He asked us to forgive him and accept a visit when he got out. That letter left me in panic. The nightmares, which had already diminished a lot, returned with force. Arnold, furious, tore up the letter and wrote to the prison administration demanding that his brother no longer have permission to contact us. Our lawyer advised us to file a police report documenting the situation. They were difficult weeks, with fear returning to haunt us. But, with the help of the support group I attended at the local church, I managed to overcome this relapse. What impressed me most was realizing that, despite the fear, I didn't fall apart like before. There was a strength in me now, built over all those years of overcoming. In 1988, we received the news that Owen had died in prison, a victim of tuberculosis. I confess I felt an immense relief. I don't wish death on anyone, but that meant he could never threaten us again, that the chapter was definitely closed. We said a small prayer as a family, not for him, but for us, thanking for the closure of that cycle. The years went by. The children grew up. Gabriel graduated in engineering and moved to Phoenix. Mariana followed the path of education, becoming a teacher right here in Flagstaff. Robert, with the adventurous spirit of his father, joined the Army and served in various regions of the country before returning to the Southwest and settling in Sedona. Arnold retired in 2002 after more than 20 years in the transport company. We already had our own house paid off, a comfortable life, although always simple. We then dedicated ourselves to enjoying the arrival of grandchildren. First came Gabriel's children, then Mariana's, and later Robert's. My embroidery studio, which started so small back in our first Flagstaff home, became my refuge and my joy. Even with age advancing, I never stopped creating, teaching the craft to other women, transforming fabric and thread into small works of art. As the old Arizona saying goes, an old hand still makes fine work. And so, between stitches and patterns, between embroidered flowers and shared stories, I wove not only tablecloths and sheets, but my own story of overcoming. Today, at my 73 years, I lead a tranquil life here in Flagstaff. Our house on Aspen Street is not as full as before, with the children grown and living their own lives. Arnold left us 7 years ago in 2018 after bravely fighting cancer. It was difficult to adapt to life without him after more than 45 years together. But as I always say, God doesn't give us a burden greater than we can carry. My day-to-day is simple and organized. I wake up early around 6 in the morning, a habit I've maintained since the times of Augusta. I prepare my coffee, feed Toby, my old and lazy cat, and sit on the porch to watch the sun rise over the mountains. Here in the Southwest, the mornings have a different light than New England, softer, especially in winter. After coffee, I go to my studio. It's the place where I feel most alive. Over time, I transformed what was an extra room into a space all my own, with my sewing machine, my threads organized by color in small drawers, my fabrics carefully folded on shelves that Arnold built for me. On the wall, I have a frame that Mariana gave me with the embroidered phrase, "Each stitch, a story. Each story, a victory." Embroidery orders continue to arrive, although I have reduced the pace in recent years. I do it more for pleasure than necessity. Arnold's retirement and my small pension are enough for my modest sustenance. But I like to keep my hands busy, to create beauty with threads and needles. And each piece I embroider carries a bit of my story, even if the clients don't know it. Mariana comes to visit me almost every day. She lives just 10 blocks from here with her husband Edward and my 2 grandchildren, Julia, 15, and Peter, 12. Julia is my embroidery companion. She has skillful hands like mine and has already learned almost all the stitches I know. Peter prefers video games, like any boy his age, but still likes to hear my stories about New England, about the giant rivers and the colorful fish. Gabriel comes from Phoenix with his family once a month. He married Claudia, an Arizona native from Tempe, and gave me 3 beautiful grandchildren: Beatrice, the oldest at 20, already in medical school; Philip, 17, who is the spitting image of his grandfather; and Caroline, 14, who inherited my slightly slanted eyes. When they're here, the house fills with life and noise, like in the old days. Robert is the one I see the least because of the distance. He settled in Sedona after leaving the army, married a Native American woman, Lucy, and has 2 small children, 8-year-old twins, Raphael and Sophia. They come during the end-of-year holidays and July vacations, always bringing gifts from the reservation and interesting stories to tell. I have a helper, Bernice, who comes 3 times a week to assist me with the heavier cleaning of the house and keep me company. She is 40 years old, a widow like me, and has a daughter who lives in Tucson. We get along very well. She is patient with my methodical way of doing things and understands when I want to talk or when I need silence. On Sundays, I go to Mass at St. Joseph's Church, here near home. Afterward, I usually have lunch at Mariana's house, with all the family who happens to be around. In the afternoon, if the weather is good, we go to the municipal park, where the grandchildren can play while we, the older ones, drink our coffee sitting on the benches, talking about life. I maintain contact with my native land through phone calls to my sister Martha, the only one who still lives in Boston. Our parents passed away many years ago, and the other siblings spread throughout the United States. Leonard is in Portland, and Albert ended up going to Los Angeles. Sometimes I feel a pang of longing for the New England chill, for the smell of rain in the forest, for the flavors of the fruits that are not found here in the Southwest. But Flagstaff is my home now, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. The memories of the kidnapping and those months of captivity still exist, but they no longer have the power they once had. They are like old scars. You know they're there, but they no longer hurt to the touch. Once in a while, I have some nightmare, especially on dates that remind me of that period, or when I see on television some news about kidnapping or violence against women. But I've learned to deal with this, to not let these shadows of the past darken my present. One of the things that helped me most to heal these old wounds was being able to share my story with other women who went through similar traumas. Not in a public way. I never wanted exposure or fame with my suffering, but in small circles, in private conversations, in support groups at the church. Each time I tell my story and see that it gives strength to another person to move forward, I feel that all that suffering gained a purpose. Today, looking back at the girl I was in Augusta, at the terrified young woman in Captivity, at the frightened mother in Boston, at the determined woman who started life over in Arizona, I feel an immense gratitude. Gratitude for having survived, for having had the chance to see my children grow up, my grandchildren be born. Gratitude for Arnold's love, who never blamed me for anything and was my safe harbor for so many decades. A few months ago, Clarice, my granddaughter who understands technology, created this page on the internet to show my embroidery. At first, I thought it was silly. Who's going to want to see the work of an old woman like me, I thought. But to my surprise, there are people from all over the United States placing orders. I've even received requests from abroad. It's strange to think that my little embroidered tablecloths are traveling to places I've never visited. Life has these surprises, doesn't it? When I think of everything I've been through, how I got here, from Maine to Arizona, from a nightmare to a full and tranquil life, I can only be thankful. As an old Arizona saying I've learned to love goes, it's not where you're from, but where you're headed that matters. And I arrived exactly where I needed to be. Here in Flagstaff, among the verdant mountains and the infinite sky of the Southwest, I found my place of peace. It's not the land where I was born, but it's the land where I was reborn. And it's here that I intend to stay, embroidering my stories, loving my family, living each day as a precious gift that deserves to be celebrated. If there's one thing I've learned in this long journey, my dears, it's that our capacity to overcome adversities is much greater than we imagine. When I was in that cabin, tied up, pregnant, not knowing if I would survive to see my child born, I could never have imagined that one day I would be here, sharing my story with you, surrounded by the love of my family, at peace with my past. For those who are going through a moment of darkness now, I want to say, the night, no matter how long it seems, always ends. Dawn may be slow in coming, may come gradually, as happened with me, but it comes. Don't give up before seeing the light of day again. The path of overcoming is not a straight line. It has ups and downs, days of victory and days of relapse. When I left that captivity, I thought the worst had passed. But I discovered that the emotional scars took much longer to heal than the physical ones. The nightmares, the constant fear, the panic attacks, all this was part of the process. And that's okay. You don't need to be strong all the time. What really makes a difference is seeking help. Alone, I wouldn't have managed. There were many hands that supported me along the way. Arnold, my parents, Mrs. Elaine, the prayer group, Dr. Bernice in Boston. Don't be ashamed to ask for help, to admit that you're suffering. This isn't weakness. It's in fact an act of courage and self-love. If you're in a dangerous situation, don't wait. Look for the nearest women's police station. Call the number 1-800-799-SAFE, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, a service that didn't exist in my time, but that today is available 24 hours a day. There are also shelters where you and your children can stay safely while you rebuild your life. For those who have already been through trauma and are in the healing process, know that every small victory counts. My first day without nightmares, the first time I managed to stay alone at home without panicking, the first walk with Gabriel without looking back every minute fearing being followed. Each of these moments was a brick in the reconstruction of my life. And remember, you are not defined by what happened to you. For a long time, I saw myself only as the woman who was kidnapped. It was as if my entire identity had been reduced to those 3 months of horror. But I am much more than that. I am daughter, sister, was wife, am mother, grandmother, friend, artisan. I am the girl who grew up on the banks of the Kennebec and the lady who grew old in the Arizona mountains. I am all the versions of me that existed before the trauma and all those that came after. Forgiveness is also an important part of the process, not necessarily forgiving who hurt you, but forgiving yourself. For a long time, I blamed myself for having been kidnapped, as if I had done something to provoke Owen's obsession, as if I could have avoided it somehow. I had to learn, with much effort, that the fault was never mine. Violence is never the victim's fault. Today, when I look back, I see that that terrible experience, although never desired, shaped me in ways I didn't imagine. It made me stronger, more empathetic, more grateful for each moment of peace. It taught me the true value of freedom, of safety, of unconditional love. I'm not saying I'm grateful for the trauma, never, but that I found a purpose amid the pain. And you can find it too. It may not be today, nor tomorrow, but one day, this wound that now seems to define your entire existence will be just a part of your story. A painful part, no doubt, but not the entire story. My dear viewers, especially those of you who are going through moments of despair with an obsessive or controlling family member, I implore you to share this video immediately with other women. Sick obsession can transform into kidnapping, into captivity, into years of trauma. I know because I lived it. Don't wait for the nightmare to begin to seek help. If you know someone who has a brother-in-law, ex-husband, or relative with possessive and frightening behavior, send this video to her right now. It could be the difference between life and death, between freedom and captivity. Leave in the comments, "I will stay alert," so I know that my story is helping other women identify the signs before it's too late. Do this now, don't wait even one more minute. I thank you from the heart for having listened to me until here. Each one of you who dedicated your time to know my story now carries a little piece of it, and perhaps, at some moment, this little piece can help someone who needs it. I'll continue here, in Flagstaff, with my embroidery, my grandchildren, my old cat, building day by day a life worth living. That's what I wish for each one of you. Not a life without pain or challenges, because that would be impossible, but a life where joys overcome sorrows, where each morning brings new possibilities. Because, my dears, what I never told anyone until today is that in that cabin, when I was at the darkest point of despair, I found a small rusty knife hidden under the mattress. For 3 consecutive nights, I put that knife to Owen's jugular while he slept, millimeters away from ending that nightmare forever. I didn't do it. Not out of pity, but because something inside me said that I needed to get out of there not as a murderer, but as a survivor. And that decision, not to become what he was, will accompany me until my last breath.